What's up, everybody? Tara Wellman here, and the 2018 season is about to get real as the Cardinals take on Wrigley Field for the first three games with the two-time defending National League Central champion Chicago Cubs. And yes, as a lifelong Cardinals fan, that's still tough to say. But if the Cardinals want to return to the postseason this fall, they'll have to play up to the level of their rivals from the north side. What level is that exactly? I don't really know, but Corey Fineran, host of the Ivy Envy podcast, hopefully does. And he's been kind enough to step into my office, so to speak, to tell me about it, and you by proxy. Now, as you all know by now, these previews have been available as video and audio only. If you're subscribed to my YouTube channel, you get to see these in all their glory with fancy graphics and team colors and all. If you're subscribed to the Birds on the Black podcast, you might miss out on the fancy visuals, but you still get all the info you need to be prepared for each and every series. This is the part where I tell you that technology is wonderful when it works, and my nemesis when it doesn't. Because after recording this delightful conversation with Corey, I discovered that my Skype recorder captured a crystal clear video feed on his end and just this awkward freeze frame on mine for the whole conversation. So it's not quite as fancy schmancy as usual, but the info is just as golden. So Corey, welcome to the show. Thanks for taking a little bit of time to help me look ahead to this weekend's big Cubs-Cardinals showdown, the first one for 2018.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, Tara.
So, okay, the Cubs are pretty much by every measure the favorites to win the division again, but let's back up a little bit. Coming off of last season, 92 wins, a trip back to the NLCS, coming just short of going back to the World Series. What did you feel like the biggest areas of concern were for the Cubs in 2018, and how do you think those were addressed over the offseason?
Yeah, well, I think that especially, like postseason play tends to, I guess, like kind of taint what your view of the team is. Whatever they struggled with, the last thing your team struggles with, like that's the biggest issue,
Yeah.
And so, as we saw in the NLCS against the Dodgers, the Cubs bullpen really just kind of melted down, and so I think the bullpen was the biggest area of concern. And but I don't think that was something that is just a recency bias or whatever from the NLCS. I think that the bullpen really did need to be upgraded and strengthened, and maybe they don't have to dip into AAA so much to bring up guys that probably shouldn't really even be up there. And I felt like that's kind of what the Cubs had to do a few times last year. And that puts a lot of pressure on the starters when your manager can't really trust who they have out in the bullpen. So I think the Cubs really did a lot to strengthen. I think they did as much as they could without overspending and kind of, I guess, they lost Wade Davis, who was excellent for the Cubs last year, but I don't really think they wanted to pay him what the Rockies paid him. So I think they were trying to be fiscally responsible with what they had, and the players that are coming up into arbitration here in the next handful of years, and potentially being able to bring in Bryce Harper or somebody like that in this upcoming offseason. So I felt like the Cubs did a lot with the amount of resources that they put into it. So, bringing in Brandon Morrow and Steve Cishek. I mean, right now, those are the two guys that have stood out the most, I think, as far as, new acquisitions for the bullpen that have really helped them a lot already this season.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about the bullpen because that has been a pretty significant factor for both the Cubs and the Cardinals early, I think. But before we get there, the season started pretty much as well as you could possibly want a season to start. And of course, I'm talking about Ian Happ hitting a home run on the first pitch of the 2018 season. As a Cardinals fan, waiting for the Cardinals game to start, I was like, come on, really? For real? But it hasn't quite been the fairy tale that you might expect to follow that. Been a little bit of a roller coaster in the first couple of weeks. Of course, splitting the series with the Marlins, then only ending up playing that one game with the Reds, then dealing with the Brewers and the Pirates back-to-back, successfully with the Brewers, a little bit of trouble with the Pirates. And then
Right.
you play the Braves and score, 11 runs in the last 3 innings of the game for a comeback win on Saturday. Taking all of that in, what do you possibly make of the first couple of weeks of the season?
And, that's just it. You can't really glean anything from the first. I mean, you really can't just in general. The first 2.5 weeks, you look at statistics, and I mean, they're so just the small sample size wreaks havoc on trying to figure out what exactly you have. And
Messes
so I
with
think you
your
have
mind.
to look, right. It does. It really does. And I think you need to, as a Cubs fan right now, like the way I look at it is, what can you take away from a game where it's like 37 degrees and raining and miserable for both teams, yet the score ends up being 14-12 or 15-12, whatever it ended up being, and it makes no sense. But I think, like, if I'm looking at a game like that, like, I can't look at that result and say, oh, well, that's what the Cubs offense is, because they didn't really hit the ball all over the place like you would expect. And tell me, like, I cannot believe there's a game where it was 37 degrees and that many runs are scored. That's like a 1-0 game, like, and 2 home runs in the first inning. It doesn't make any sense. But yeah, and that's what, I feel like the Cubs really have been pretty stable over, really since the second half of 2015. They pretty much are what they appear to be. And it doesn't really change too much. And so really, I kind of feel like that's what, a lot of Cubs fans can be irritated with, their inability to hit with runners in scoring position. Well, guess what? They hit like 237 with runners in scoring position last year. So that's probably going to carry over. That's kind of what this team is. So it's been an interesting, and the fact, I mean, you can probably agree with me, the fact that the Brewers are sitting atop the division and the Pirates and the Brewers are right there in the mix of it, which I think we kind of expected, but I don't think we expected the Pirates to be playing as well as they are right now. And but that's what makes baseball fun, I guess.
The Pirates kind of did that for a little while last year. The Reds sort of did that at the beginning of last season, where all of a sudden they were hanging out at the top of the division and everybody was going, this can't be right.
And I expected that this year, but
right.
not.
That is not what the Reds are, at least not this far into the season. But it's funny, you mentioned the way that as fans, it's easy to sort of get wrapped up in every single moment of every single game. It's been interesting watching, because I think we get sort of secluded into our own fan base most of the time and see the drama, including Twitter drama and the way people react to things within our own fan base. It's been interesting and a little bit fun, just from an outsider's perspective, to see another team's fan base sort of going through those same roller coaster of emotions, and our team's the greatest to our team's never going to win again. Right. How do you sort of ride that wave, talking to people? And I'm sure you have friends and Cubs fans who try to help figure out what this team is, and all of a sudden you're dealing with a lot of drama to start the year.
Yeah, the fact that, being involved in Cubs social media and baseball social media, I mean, you can't really avoid Cubs Twitter, and it tends to, and I'm sure it's the same way with Cardinals Twitter. Yeah. The extremes are who kind of dictate the conversation, and so with our podcast, what we tend to do is we try to be a little more stable, I guess, in our evaluation of the Cubs. There are people that interact with us that swear that this is the worst Cubs team they've ever seen, and I find it amazing that you can become that spoiled in the matter of like 2 or 3 years.
How quickly people forget.
Exactly. And that this is the same team that has done all of those magical things that we have seen over the last few years. And so, a lot of the feedback we get from listeners on our podcast is that they listen to us to kind of like bring them back to reality, that we kind of have that like calming effect where we're not being overly positive. I mean, you still have to discuss and address the things that are, issues with the team. But at the same time, you have to keep things into perspective that as Cubs fans, we have seen much worse teams than the players that are on the field right now, and we can't forget that.
You mentioned the fact that the Cubs have basically been this team that's pretty good for the last couple of seasons. I think the flip side is where Cardinals fans are right now, in that they've seen their team get progressively worse over the last couple of seasons. And so then to start to see some of those similarities early in the year, that's when the panic starts to set in a little bit. But likewise, I think it's probably best not to take too much out of the first 2.5 weeks of the season and just sort of let things settle in a little bit. Let the weather warm up, for one thing, so you can start playing some normal games and then go from there. But you mentioned one of the primary concerns for the Cubs early on has been hitting with runners in scoring position. It also actually has been for the Cardinals as well, and that's something that I've talked a lot about in the last couple of weeks, is that even when they're scoring runs, they're leaving a lot of runs on the table. They're not necessarily scoring in ways that are sustainable. For comparison, right now the Cardinals are hitting 235 with runners in scoring position. The Cubs, I believe, are at 193 with runners in scoring position. I was shocked that it was even that much difference, because it feels like the Cardinals have maybe had 2 hits with runners in scoring position all season so far. So again, perception is not always reality. But is this something that you're concerned about?
I mean, I am as far as that you don't want to see your team hitting below 200 with runners in scoring position. And really, 237, I think that's what they were last year, somewhere in there. Like, that's not great either. But I think that a lot of fans fall into this, just unrealistic expectations of, if you're, they should be hitting like 500 with runners in scoring position. It's like, well, no, that's, that's not how it works. And I think that one thing that I've always kind of seen, the Cubs have, over the last 2 or 3 years, have been right there at the top of Major League Baseball, and as far as runs scored, and I mean, yeah, you have to hit with runners in scoring position, but at the same time, the Cubs get on base, and when you have a lot of guys getting on base, you can't always drive them in. Like, the inning is going to end with someone on base, and they may be on second or third base. So, it doesn't really concern me too much. Of course, I don't like to see it where it is right now. And there are moments where it's extremely frustrating, especially in these first couple of weeks, where there have been a lot of opportunities, and a lot of the games they've lost, they have missed great opportunities. And those are the games that they're going over 7 or over 9 with runners in scoring position. And it is very frustrating. But over the course, thankfully, this is a 162 game season, and those things do, balance out over the course of time. And for every game where that happens, they go 0 for 9, they're going to have a game where they're 6 for 11 or something like that. So I really do think it balances out, and it's not something that I'm overly concerned about.
I was listening to your podcast in preparing for this, making sure I knew a little bit about where the Cubs were so far this season. And you said something to the effect of, I'd rather have runners in scoring position and sometimes not drive them in than not have runners in scoring position. And I thought that was a very astute way of putting it, because it's true. And the Cardinals have been in a number of situations, especially in this last series with the Reds, where they're not facing great pitching. They're getting walked a lot. And in the back of your mind, you're thinking, yeah, okay, but they're still not driving in these runs. But they do have the opportunities. And, when you have runners on base, things are likely going to happen. Sometimes they're going to break your way. Sometimes they're not. But you're more likely to score with runners in scoring position than without.
You're right.
So
yeah.
there's that.
And let's be fair. Like, the weather has been miserable in the Midwest so far this season. And so, there's a reason I wasn't outside doing stuff today. It's because it was miserable. And I would not want to go outside and play ball. And if I did, my numbers would probably not be very good. So
yeah, it was snowing here again today. And I really just wanted to hibernate until summer actually decides to show up. And I can imagine that most professional baseball players feel the same way. They'd like to just not play until it's warm outside either.
I mean, you look in, I'm not making an excuse for a team, but at the same time, you look at like what happened in yesterday's game with giving up, Quintana having a really difficult time pitching. you try going out there when it's 37 degrees and raining and try to get a good grip on a ball when you're not used to that type of weather. So, I mean, I really think offensively and pitching, everything, like he just kind of, I'm not saying just throw it out completely, but know that these things are going to happen.
Now, one guy that the Cubs have been without is Anthony Rizzo. What is his status? Is he going to be back for the series with the Cardinals? And do you expect that he will be pretty much back to 100%?
Yeah, they said today that he will be back for tomorrow's game. I think, and Rizzo's had some of these back issues in the past. And so it was one of those things where when they put him on the DL or even when the first couple games that he sat out wasn't completely surprising. Just because it has been cold. I mean, well, I guess they were in, Cincinnati was cold, I think. So he had played in at least one cold game. But, when they came up to Milwaukee, it was in the 30s. I mean, granted, it's a dome, but it was still chilly in there. And then coming to Wrigley now, like, I just think that they put him on that 10-day deal because there's no reason to have Anthony Rizzo out there early season, playing in a series that, every win matters or whatever, but it's not worth the risk of having him on the DL for a longer period of time because of his back. So now whether or not he steps right back in on Monday and is just like he always was, I don't know. But I really don't think that the Cubs would have him in this series or playing on Monday if he wasn't 100%. And, he's just he's the type of player that it feels like even when he is not, if he's in a cold stretch or something in a slump, he's still dangerous at the plate. He still really makes pitchers work. He's still going to get those hit by pitches. So he's going to get on base. So I really don't know what to expect from him in this series with the Cardinals, but I will say it's going to be nice to have him back because you look at some of their offensive struggles here in these first few weeks. And when one of the best bats is not in the order, you think about, what could have maybe happened if he was in the order.
And he hit 283 with runners in scoring position last year. So I imagine he'll be a key to sort of changing the trend there. Another thing that a lot of people have been talking about besides Javi Baez, because everyone's talking about Javier Baez, is the Cubs, and we can talk about Javi if you want, but is the Cubs strikeout numbers. That's the sort of other thing that seems to be what people are a little concerned about. Now, the Cardinals actually have more strikeouts on the young season than the Cubs do. I think starting the year against Syndergaard, DeGrom, and Robbie Ray probably has something to do with that. Some pretty high strikeout pitchers there. But again, is this something that you see normalizing a little bit, or is this sort of who the Cubs are and they're successful in spite of that?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. I mean, if you look at their strikeout rate, I believe it's within a percentage point of what it was last season for the whole season. So this is what they are. They're going to strike out. I think their strikeout rate is somewhere around 23 or 25%, somewhere in there. It's a team that does strike out. But I think that with certain players, you're seeing those strikeout rates go down. And so that's really encouraging when you look at individual players. But strikeouts don't really concern me, and especially with an offense that is built like the Cubs offense is built. If you have a lot of guys that can knock the ball out of the park, they're most likely going to strike out a lot too. And so that's just kind of what this team is. And I think that like with any fan base, those things are only issues really when the team loses. So I think, if the Cubs could actually get a little bit of a winning streak going, I think, a lot of that concern would kind of go away, and a lot of fans would realize like, oh yeah, that's just what this team is.
Obviously, like I said, adding Rizzo back into the mix helps sort of normalize what that lineup looks like on a day-to-day basis. I was looking at it though. The Cubs so far have used 13 different batting orders this season in 14 games. The Cardinals have used 7, which is a pretty dramatic change from a Mike Matheny sort of era mentality. He's normally the guy that changes it every day. When you look at the lineup, the leadoff spot has been something that's been talked about. Who's going to hit leadoff for the Cubs? Is it Happ? Is it Almora? What do you do in that spot? And then sort of how does that shift everything else? What do you think should happen or do you expect to happen with this sort of ever-changing lineup?
Well, I don't think that's going to change. I mean, that's kind
sort
of
of the
what,
Madden way.
yeah, right. That's what Joe Madden's done since he came over. And I think that, when you look at the lineup that the Cubs have, I don't really think this is a team where you can just have an everyday lineup, because there are guys that need to be worked in. And at the beginning of the season, Ben Zobrist was injured during spring training, didn't play a lot. Last year did not have a great year. He's getting older. I think he's 36 or 37, somewhere in there. And so you think, okay, well, this is kind of the downside. It's he's on his way down. And then he comes out to start the season and is playing great. He's got an OBP over 400. And so you're like, well, okay, well, they got to work him into the lineup. So, he's somebody that could be your leadoff guy, but then where exactly do you put him on the field? Because if you put him in at second base, which is kind of what he was brought to the Cubs to play second base, that's taking Javi Baez off the field, which I don't think anybody wants. And so it's just, I don't envy Madden in his responsibility of developing young players, getting them the time that they need, and fielding the team that gives you the best chance to win. And I don't really think the Cubs, I don't expect them to have a regular leadoff hitter. I think it's going to be between Zobrist, Almora, and Happ probably for the most part. But and that's not necessarily a bad thing either, because you can just kind of play the hot hand and play. And right now it's been Zobrist. So it's interesting to see what Madden does with his lineups, and the what a lot of Cubs fans would tell you, not me necessarily, is that perhaps our right fielder needs to not play quite so much. But personally, even though he's nowhere near the offensive threat that he was when he was with the Cardinals, I love having him on defense, and I feel bad for him, so I just don't want to. I don't want to see him on the bench, I guess. But yeah, I don't. If you're looking for stability and an everyday lineup that Joe runs out there, it's just not going to happen.
I think, well, first of all, listen, as a Cardinals fan, I feel bad for Jason Hayward. So it's been a rough go. But you're right. Defensively, he still adds value there, and there's no denying that. But I do think it takes an interesting mix of players to sort of adapt to that constant change and not necessarily know where they're going to be in the lineup or on the field when they come to the stadium every day. And I think that's an interesting approach. The Cardinals have tried to do that the last couple of years, giving Mike Matheny a lot of flexibility as far as guys that can play multiple positions, guys that can hit different places in the order, and it hasn't worked. This year they've gone for a much more stable look, and it's interesting because you wake up and look at the lineup for that day and you expect it to be something crazy, and more often than not it's the same 8 guys going out there. Now there have been some injuries that have made it a little bit easier. Jed Jerko will be returning to the team here shortly, maybe for this series. They haven't confirmed that yet. And that complicates things a little bit on the infield. But other than that, it's been pretty copy and paste most of the time, unless it's a getaway day or some lefty that they've already won the series, and then you have no idea what the lineup's going to look like. It could be just about anything. They had Greg Garcia leading off the other day in a game. That was interesting. But yeah, I do think it takes a different mindset for the players to come in knowing that sort of inconsistency is going to be the norm.
Yeah, and I think that's something that Madden has probably kind of instilled in these players. And I think it helps the fact that most of them are young and have come up since 2015. And so they've been with Madden and they know that that's just the way that it goes. And I think that because they've had success, it's easy to say like, hey, well, I think a lot of athletes, yeah, sure, of course, they care about their individual numbers and performances and stuff, but they also care about wins. And so I think that, I don't think it'll always be this way. I think that there will be a season or a time when things could get a little bit, I don't want to say they could get ugly, but I think that you could have some players that are like, hey, I deserve this and I deserve a regular spot, and I'm, playing third base today and left field tomorrow and first base the day after that. And, it's not exactly I'm not exactly in Little League. I'd like to know where I'm playing. So, but yeah, I think for right now, it's worked so far, and I think that Madden will continue to do that. And I think that with this front office, I think that the Cubs have really made an effort to. I mean, ever since Thed and Gio, sorry, Theo and Jed came in, they kind of made sure that they drafted and brought in the right people. They talked a lot about character and things like that, and I think that that's part of that personality test or whatever for the Cubs is somebody that is going to be flexible and play can play under someone like Joe Madden, which was a little bit surprising that John Lackey came to the Cubs, but hey,
surprising when he came to the Cardinals too, but that's a different story. So I do actually want to talk about pitching before we wrap this up. But before I do that, I want to ask one more question about a position player because a couple of years ago, Matt Adams showed up to spring training actually in the best shape of his life, not just saying that. And then this year, Jed Jerko showed up having lost a bunch of weight, super skinny. I had several people tell me that I needed to ask you about Skinny Schwarber.
Yeah.
What is the latest on Schwarber and how this new physique is playing into the young season?
Well, he looks good, that's for sure. Yeah, I think that's I just talked about like character, and that they wanted to bring in a certain type of player, and I think that because they reached for Schwarber in the draft, that was the narrative, that he was expected to go later in the first round. The Cubs had an earlier pick and grabbed him, and a lot of people thought that was a little strange. And I think that what we have seen from him, like as far as his work ethic goes, I think that's the reason, one of the big reasons that he is on this team. And I think that, he was a guy that probably didn't have to worry about his weight too much when he was behind the plate and probably, in college playing for Indiana because you just don't have those same expectations of agility and everything that all of a sudden when he's pushed into left field, he needs to be a little bit more agile. And that's really what I took away from this last offseason. Of course, my information source is the highly produced Cubs videos that they put out. But watching him do a lot of those agility drills and, I was really excited. More than him losing weight was to see that he was more agile in the field and had better footwork. And we haven't necessarily seen that yet this year, but it's a long season. I think we'll have the opportunity to see that. But I've tried to lose weight. It's tough. I'm impressed when somebody can lose 30. Of course, they have better trainers than we do, I guess.
Helps when you have the resources, right?
Yeah. But I think, there are a lot of players that don't make those changes. And I think the big concern with Schwarber was, he's a guy that can hit the ball on top of the scoreboard. And if he drops 30 or 40 pounds, how much of that is muscle? How much of it was baby fat? And is that going to affect his power? And from what we've seen so far, it did not affect his power. He's only got 3 home runs, but in 2.5 weeks, that's not too bad. So I think that, based on the struggles that we saw from him last year at the beginning of the season and then being sent to Iowa and AAA, I think that he is the type of player that is, he seems to be extremely motivated and to really put a lot of work into his game. And so I think that the weight loss was part of it. And that undoubtedly has to help him in the field too, I think, as far as being able to get around.
Imagine what also helps in the field is it not being raining or snowing when you're playing in the field. So hopefully we can get away from that at some point. But as far as the pitching, looking forward to this series with the Cubs not playing on Sunday sort of shifts the probable pitchers. The Cardinals will not see Yu Darvish, or as one of the Cardinals commentators today said, I believe he called him Hugh Darvish. That was so it could be Hugh Darvish. They're not going to see him either, whoever that is. They're also not going to see Quintana. It'll be Chatwood, Hendricks, and Lester in the 3 games for the Cardinals against Waka, Wainwright, and Weaver. Not in that order,
right?
But those are the 3 that they'll see. And when you look at what this rotation has been for the Cubs, some high expectations, I think. Maybe a little bit of a slow start.
Yeah, and I think, we keep kind of like going back to the well on this weather stuff, but I think it is an issue. But I also think that we've seen really good starts from pretty much each one of these pitchers, and we've seen really bad starts from each one of these pitchers. And there's, Chatwood is your number 5, and so you would expect. I think it's safe to expect number 5 type outings from him. And it's not shocking in the early season to see really any starter kind of struggle. And I don't want to blame the weather, but there have been specific instances. For instance, Quintana yesterday, and even Darvish the day before, that it just there was weird things that happened in the game. He actually got called for a balk and just completely lost it. And so I think that, little things like that those are the types of things that, like, at the end of the season, you'll be like, oh yeah, I remember that one start that was really bad. That's strange. But right now those things kind of like really stand out. And so I'm looking for more consistency from the starting pitchers. I think as the weather warms up, as they're able to get better grips on the ball, as they're, and I actually, one thing I actually meant to look at before we talked today was it seemed like the starters also I felt like maybe they didn't get quite enough work in spring training, that their innings were kind of low. And so that, and I think part of that would be the fact that, not to sound like anything is expected, but the Cubs have made the postseason for the last handful of years. And so you also don't want your starters to kind of run out of gas at that point in the season. And so I thought, well, maybe that's why they were taking it easier on them. But that also means that you're using early season games as kind of tune-up starts, I guess. So it has been a very strange set of games so far, because you literally have seen a great outing and a pretty poor outing from each pitcher. And so I think if we could get somewhere in the middle, then that would be good.
It's funny that you mentioned the spring training innings, because that's something I actually brought up about the Cardinals rotation after their first time through the rotation, and then a couple of guys into that second time through, and all of a sudden they were looking a lot better. And I wondered the same thing. None of them pitched really more than 4 innings in spring training games, with a couple of exceptions. And surprisingly, those guys that had pitched more in the spring looked a lot sharper their first time through the rotation. So I do think that comes into play alongside the weather and just the early season, sort of getting into that routine. And it's interesting seeing that sort of carry through to maybe another organization doing the same thing. I mentioned that the bullpen has been a relative strength for the Cubs so far, and I would say for the Cardinals, after an offseason where I feel like I have a lot of friends who are Cubs fans, and we talked about this in relation to our relative teams and what their plans were for the bullpen, because there were a lot of pieces that had to fall into place, and it didn't look really good to be completely honest most of the offseason. And the Cardinals really, they didn't sign a closer until opening day, and we still haven't seen a whole lot of good out of Greg Holland yet. But the shaping up of the bullpen has been sort of a work in progress. But I think you mentioned adding Morrow, adding Steve Cishek, and the Cardinals have on their end a young stud in Jordan Hicks, who's just blowing everybody away at 21 years old. They've gotten some surprisingly good innings from Bud Norris out of the bullpen. So all of a sudden, these two teams that looked like they might have some relief issues, it seems to be a bit of a strength so far. Is that surprising to you, or did you feel like maybe the expectations were unnecessarily low?
Well, for the Cubs, I mean, I think that I did expect the bullpen to look pretty good. And I think that the bullpen looked really good at times last year, and then not good at all at times. But I think, what I tend to tell a lot of Cubs fans is every team's bullpen stinks some of the time. And so, there's a reason that these guys aren't starters. And it's bound to happen when you come out and you pitch one inning, or you pitch to one batter it doesn't take much for your ERA to suddenly look terrible and for these bad games to really stand out. For instance, Carl Edwards Jr., who I think is probably the closer of the future, maybe. I hope. He kind of had the same thing where like he looks great most of the time, and then he'll have a couple of games where he just cannot find the strike zone, and it might take him 2 or 3 appearances after that, like I think is somewhat common with young pitchers, to be able to build that confidence back up. But the Cubs bullpen has looked great. The Cubs really haven't had to use them a lot, and they've kind of been blessed with good timing of days off and rainouts and things. And so I think that but the bullpen will look ugly. At some point, I absolutely guarantee it. So
it's sort of inevitable that at some point you're going to be thinking, "There's no one out there that can get outs, especially in the 9th inning."
yeah. Let's. I'm hoping it doesn't happen this week against the Cardinals.
Well, in that light, when I look at the Cubs lineup, there are a number of guys that every time I look at that lineup, I think, man, if they can just get past Rizzo, or if they can just get past this one guy, I'm going to feel pretty good about their chances in this series. When you look at the Cardinals this year, is there someone or a part of that lineup or a guy in the bullpen that you think, man, this is the part of this series that's going to be tough?
Yeah, so I mean, if I look at historically, it's just felt like the Cardinals lineup was full of those types of players. And so, I can think of, several, Grichuk and Piscotty that are no longer with the team. It just seemed like they killed the Cubs every time given,
they
had the
didn't kill anybody else, but the Cubs, they were great.
Oh, no. And that's a very common thing across baseball. Let me tell you,
Yes.
there are lots of players that are Cubs killers, and that's it. But, I mean, the same thing. And that's the way I felt like when Hayward was on the Cardinals. I just dreaded seeing him come up because, I mean, he had such a great season in 2015, but it just seemed like the Cubs could not get him out. And that's one reason I was so excited when the Cubs did sign him. But I guess as far as this year goes, I think Molina is always that guy. I never feel comfortable with him up there if the game is close. I think Carpenter, for the most part, except for when he's pitching Lester, who seems to be able to dominate him, which so those two guys just historically have been, I think Jerko, I can remember a couple times last year, he seemed to, come up with some really timely hits against the Cubs. But then this year, I'm really intrigued by Jose Martinez. And I'm a little nervous about, the numbers that he's putting up heading into this series. But then, Ozuna, being new, that's, I don't know. I'm a Cubs fan, so instinctively I'm scared of other players. So I listed a whole bunch.
Sure. Well, I mean, I could have listed a lot more than just Rizzo, but he seems to be the one that always comes up, and I'm like, well, this inning's not going to end well.
Yeah.
But yeah, Jose Martinez, I think, is intriguing a lot of people, Cardinals fans included. Honestly, I didn't expect quite this much from him. But man, there's no one that he's faced that he can't hit off of, and it's amazing to see him sort of come out of nowhere after a career in the minor leagues and be as good as he is. But he's been. Wait a minute.
I got to call you out on that. That is what the Cardinals do. Like
that's true. That is true.
It should not surprise you at all. You should be used to this.
But usually there's some inkling of knowing they're coming, even if the rest of baseball doesn't. With Jose Martinez, he was kind of that guy that was like that quad A player that you were just like, yeah, he's fine, and I'm sure he'd be serviceable as a backup, but he's not going to come up and lead the National League in almost every offensive category. And all of a sudden, here he is, threatening to lead the league in all the offensive categories. So it's been, even as a Cardinals fan who's used to seeing that, right. Jose Martinez was still a bit of a surprise, I think.
Yeah. I don't know if he can, sustain it, I guess. But
sure, and that's the question.
Early in the season for this series, I am nervous about him.
Yeah, well, it may be for the Cardinals good timing for him taking on the Cubs with the run that he's been on, but we'll see. One thing is for sure, I never try to predict Cubs-Cardinals games because everything that you can possibly think of is possible in this series. So we'll just have to see what happens, especially with the weird things that have happened already in the first 2 weeks.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Well, Corey, I won't take up any more of your time, but thanks so much for helping me set the stage for what I'm sure will be another wild and exciting rivalry series between the Cubs and the Cardinals. The Red Sox and the Yankees might think they have the best rivalry in baseball, and the brawl the other night may have
Right.
instigated some of that, but I may be a little biased, but I think the Cubs and the Cardinals are right up there.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this is so much fun that I'm really happy that, like, a couple years ago, I really felt that the Cardinals were kind of on their way down. It kind of seemed like 2015 was kind of like the passing of the torch, it felt like. But a part of me, and I hope none of our listeners hear me say this, I really enjoy both teams being competitive. I think that it's a lot of fun. And I look forward to like every Cubs Cardinals series. I have a lot of friends that are Cardinals fans. And so I just think it's a lot of fun. I think it's good for the Midwest. I think it's great that, the Cubs Cardinals series started started the season did they do it? Yeah, they did it 2 years in a row, I think. Yeah. And we've gotten a lot of the Sunday night ESPN broadcasts. I mean, I just think it's good for the division. It's good for the National League. It's good for the Midwest. And it's a lot of fun.
Well, I fully expect it to be another fun season. I think the NL Central is going to be interesting this year. So it's been a quick start to some of that drama with all the NL Central games this month, and I'm sure this weekend will be no different. So thanks again for your time.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me on.
You might have noticed, but the weather was a bit of a theme throughout this preview, and it's been a theme throughout most of the first 2.5 weeks of the season. As of Sunday night, it looks like Monday will once again be very cold at game time. Tuesday will be barely warmer, and Wednesday's forecast calls for a rain-snow mix. So we may or may not play 3 games at Wrigley this week. But if we do, it'll be Adam Wainwright and Tyler Chatwood in Game 1 on Monday at 6:05, both looking for their first wins on the year, if pitcher wins is a stat that you care about. Then it's Michael Wacha against John Lester in Game 2 with a 7:05 start time, and if either pitcher can feel their fingers in spite of the wind chill, they'll be looking to tighten things up a bit after a couple of so-so starts. And then it's Luke Weaver opposite Kyle Hendricks on Wednesday. Now, Weaver carries a .98 whip into Wednesday's start, while Hendricks, at 17 innings pitched, has seen the most action of any of the Cubs' 5 starters. But honestly, throw it all out the window. Nothing really seems to happen according to plan when the Cubs and the Cardinals play ball, and I don't expect this series to be any different. Don't forget to check out birdsontheblack.com for daily recaps on About Last Night, as well as tons of other goodies from the rest of the gang. I'm Tara Wellman. Thanks again to Corey Fineran. I'll see you next time.